Whether you're listening on your favorite podcast app or watching on YouTube, welcome to the Lions Roar podcast, brought to you by Lions Roar, a nonprofit media organization offering Buddhist wisdom and guidance for mindful living to benefit our lives and create a more caring and just world. For more, go to lionsroar.com, and if you enjoy this episode, subscribe so you don't miss future ones. In this insightful discussion with the Buddhadharma editorial team, Tibetologist David Germano talks about his work on the Generative Contemplation Initiative, a suite of projects that explore in depth the research on contemplative practices and how such practices might be more widely and/or pointedly applied to be of utmost benefit. Hello, I'm Rod Mead-Sperry, and I'm here with Mariana Restrepo. Together, we are the editorial team of Buddhadharma. We're joined today by David Germano. David divides his time between teaching, directing the Tibetan and Himalayan Library and Tibet Center, and working on a new Generative Contemplation Initiative, all at University of Virginia. David, thanks for joining us. So tell us about this Generative Contemplative Initiative. Who is it for? What is it meant to do?
So the idea behind the genesis of the Generative Contemplation Initiative goes back a long time for me, maybe about 14 years ago or so, when I started at the University of Virginia to think more about contemporary uses of contemplation based upon my study of Tibetan Buddhist contemplation for a lot longer than that. And I initially had this idea that I would like to create a kind of theoretical and practical foundation for the work that I was doing at the University of Virginia. But the kind of exigencies and kind of hectic character of what we were doing at the University of Virginia kind of outstripped my capacity to do that. And I just got frustrated for 13 years leading the Contemplative Science Center at the University of Virginia. And so last year, I kind of stepped out of those roles, and I decided that I would like to just really focus on creating this different theoretical and practical basis for both the study of contemplative practice and traditions, but also for thinking about the kinds of research and creative applications we might do in the future. So that's the motivation behind it. And in terms of the kind of what does this constitute in? Right now, we're in a kind of finishing up a one-year pilot, a startup, to kind of show the viability and create the methodology and so forth, and create the foundation for then scaling it up over the next couple of years. And so the basic idea behind it is to think of contemplation as a fundamentally generative human capacity. So rather than looking at contemplation in Catholicism or indigenous traditions or Hinduism or Taoism or Buddhism or whatever it might be, or Islam, as a series of products that have procedural instructions that we can master and deploy and so forth, instead it's thinking about these traditions as deeply generative capacities, the way that language is a deeply generative human capacity. And so when we think about language as a kind of analogy for thinking about contemplation, since we have a lot more sophisticated contemporary theorization and academic research and so forth on language compared to contemplation, we can look at the way in which we acquire linguistic competency as a child or as an infant. They're immersed in an environment. They don't study a set of procedural instructions and learn how to do it. Neither do they master a series of linguistic products like speeches or this way of talking and so forth. Instead, they find themselves immersed in an environment in English or French or Tibetan or Chinese, whatever it might be, and they master in an immersive, tacit fashion a lexicon, a vocabulary, and they master a set of rules or grammar for how those vocabularies can be adjusted and put together and shaped into meaningful utterances. And finally, they instinctively begin to master a series of communicative context for when we say this and when we say that, and when we talk like this, when we talk like that. So basically, you have a lexicon, you have a grammar, you have a context, and there, by mastering all three, you have linguistic competency. So if we think about that paradigm in the context of contemplation, we can ask the question, what is the lexicon of a particular contemplative tradition, such as in Tibetan Buddhism or Catholicism? What are the fundamental elements, the building blocks, the postures, the gazes, the dispositions, the mindsets, etc., that are the toolbox from which any contemplative practice will be fashioned and refashioned and changed over time? And then secondly, we can ask the question of what are the principles or the grammar, the principles by which these elements are put together, the kind of morphology, the way these elements are taken and put in particular shape and specific context for a given meditative practice, we can think about the syntax, the way these elements are ordered, the way they're put together, then form modules that are sequenced over the life or the session of a particular practice. And then we can ask the question about the semantics, how meaning takes place and so forth. And then finally, we can ask, what are the context of a contemplative practice, the philosophy, the time, the space, the social interactions, the aesthetics, etc. And these kind of contexts are typically not articulated within the context of a instructional procedural instructions for a particular meditation, but rather everybody within the tradition knows them and it's taken for granted. It's that kind of tacit knowledge and often explicit knowledge that you study in other contexts, but then come to bear and shape the nature of the meditation. So a generative fluency, a fluency in a particular generative contemplative tradition means mastering those elements, understanding those principles, understanding those contexts, so that you as a creator of meditations can constantly spin out new and revised and completely unprecedented forms of meditation, drawing upon those first principles. And you as a practitioner then are not simply memorizing a practice, but you're beginning to tap into that deeper level of fluency as you take the instructions and begin to make them your own. So that's the initial idea, or the kind of theoretical foundation or framework for the initiative overall, is to think about meditation in this way. And I can go into more detail about what those elements are, but that's the first part of the project.
Okay. So what would the second part of the project be?
And so just to complete that first part, the elements, maybe just to give a little bit of detail on that just for a minute. So the elements we're thinking of as consisting of essentially 5 different pieces or 5 different groupings of elements. One is the methods or techniques. So all the stuff that procedural instructions specify, the stuff you learn the script for, the stuff that when you're a novice, okay, my body is held in this way, my gaze is held in this way, my mindset is this way, my meditative object is this. So all those methods and techniques, and those initially take precedence. But then there's the experience. If method is the script of the meditation, experience is like the quicksilver of the meditation. It's all the experiences which are elicited or stimulated or unfold out of those methods or techniques. And as the practice unfolds, increasingly, the experience becomes the driving logic of the actual practice. And then the third part would be the aesthetics, or the languages and symbols of how the meditation is presented. A friend of mine this summer mentioned a kind of way in which video games are done, which was helpful, maybe in a simple way of understanding the aesthetics, where he talked about, first you get the kind of mechanics of the video game, like this goes up, this goes down, this opens up, etc. But then once you've gotten that down, you have to think about what's the aesthetics, what's the images, what's the style, etc. So in the same way, you can have a subtle body meditation that's all about flowing waters and fluids, or it can be about rushing airs and winds, or etc. So there's so many different ways in which aesthetics determines the nature of the experience and the methods. Number 4, there's the life world, which is all these contexts, the larger life world in which these people are situated, which is a fundamental element of the meditation. And then finally, there's outcomes. There's changes in ways of being, fundamental insights, healing, whatever the outcomes are. And so the basic theory of change then, which is what we're focused on, is when you put these elements together with the grammar or the organization of these elements, together with the kind of context of the meditation, then you get the outcomes. And so the question for any given meditation then is to look at all these details and ask the question, which of these methods or experiences or aesthetics or ways of organizing or context, which are absolutely critical for generating that outcome that you're hoping for, like increased compassion or greater emotional balance or whatever it might be, and which one of these things is incidental. In the language of science, they would talk about mediators and moderators. A mediator is some part of the practice that fundamentally is crucial to generating that outcome. Without it, the outcome won't happen. A moderator is important, but it's important in terms of it influencing the outcome. It won't completely undercut the outcome, but it will adjust the intensity of the outcome or its duration or its impact and so forth. And then there are things that are purely incidental. The deity's red, make it blue, no change in the outcome. Or you're sitting up, you lay down, no change in the outcome. But if you lay down and the outcome doesn't happen, then that was a fundamental kind of mediator. So that's the kind of end of the first part of the theme, which is to try to document these practices in the context of what we're doing right now of Tibetan Buddhism, and ask the question for each practice then, based upon this generative analysis, what is the theory of change that's operative? What's crucial, what's important, and what's completely incidental? Now, the second part of the practice then, or the second part of the initiative, is to think about how do we design contemplative practices in a contemporary context? And so we're drawing upon design thinking. We're looking at some of the kind of classic models of design thinking out there, like the Stanford D School and the British Design Council and the IDEO Company and so forth. And each one of these presents a kind of model for how creativity happens or how you design something, whether it's a new product or a service or an experience. And there's a kind of model for a process. And then there's a toolkit. There's a toolkit, a design toolkit that gives little design tools that you can then employ for the designers to work together with their clientele and so forth and going through this process. And then there's also mindsets that are encouraged on the part of the designer as well as the kind of stakeholders as you go through this design process. So the second part of our initiative is asking the question, what would a contemplative design process look like? A design process that's geared towards actually designing new contemplative practices, but also is itself intrinsically a contemplative journey, one that hopefully in the process creates greater compassion, greater wisdom, etc., for the designers as well as the stakeholders, even as it also produces a kind of final kind of outcome, which is a contemplative practice or a contemplative environment that's precisely situated for these people in this environment. And so the connection between the two is that we're drawing upon the generative analysis of the contemplative practices, in this case, starting with Tibetan Buddhism, to create the design tools and the design mindsets and the design model. We're kind of merging our analysis, the generative analysis of contemplation, with the kind of wisdom that we can garner from these contemporary design processes to merge them together so that the elements and principles drawn from the contemplative tradition find its way into the design toolkit, the design mindset, the design model, and so forth. And so the third and final part of the project then is to think about, not to think about, but to actually then apply that design process to work with specific people in specific contexts to design new contemplative practices. So let's say people are in a clinic and they're trying to deal with chronic pain, which is what spawned the mindfulness-based stress reduction, or elementary school teachers, or an HR firm, or people dealing with teenagers who are suffering from anxiety, or whatever it might be, that we start with those people and their context. And instead of thinking, what can we adapt, what can we translate, what can we water down from the Buddhist tradition or another contemplative tradition, instead, we draw upon these first principles, the elements, the grammar, the context, and using the contemplative design process, the aspiration then is to design things from the ground up that are completely precisely and ideally perfectly situated for those people in that context, to work for them in their time, in their space, in their kind of life world, and so forth. So those three phases, kind of basically scholarship, this generative scholarship, number two, creating this contemplative design process, and three, applying the design process to solve specific human and broader ecological problems in the world today. Those three parts are essentially the fundamental framework of the Generative Contemplation Initiative. Oh. And then here's the practice as such, et cetera, et cetera. So that's what a presentation of a particular node looks like at the level of the Encyclopedia of Contemplation. Now, what's the benefit of all this? There's several benefits. So one benefit is the design process, that when we're thinking about designing new contemplative practices, our feeling is that by creating this encyclopedia of resources, as well as the contemplative design process, that we're encouraging people to be much more conscious, intentional, and deliberate in how they think about designing contemplative practices. So by virtue of looking back at the encyclopedia and seeing all the different things, all the different factors, the context, the elements, the principles of organizations that Tibetans, at least, were drawing upon, then you can begin to ask the question, oh, that's an interesting issue. How might that be relevant over here? So, for example, seasonality of meditation, that certain meditations are good for winter, but not for spring, or good for summer, but not for fall, or thinking about the temporality of meditation, or thinking about the dispositional nature of an individual practitioner and how that might mean you have to adjust the meditation for that person. There's so many different things that if they're fully exposed and presented in a kind of cogent way that you can explore, will help you then think about these issues in the context of your own design work. So that's one I've already covered. The other values that we see here is for scientists. So scientists don't have the time to go off the deep end and spend decades of their life, studying different languages and going abroad and studying these contemplative practices in great detail. So part of my initial premise was, what would it be like if I was a scientist with all the deep expertise of my discipline, and yet someone over on the other side of contemplation, teachers, humanists, etc., took the time to create an enabling resource that would enable me with a modest amount of work to create like a basic understanding that's a little bit like what someone might be who's an actual teacher of this tradition or a scholar of this tradition. And then when I'm thinking about the meditation and doing research on it, I have a much fuller understanding of all the things that go into that meditation, and thereby my research becomes all the more efficacious. Because if I'm a scientist and I'm studying meditation to see what its outcome is, but I have an inadequate understanding of all the richness that goes into that meditation, I don't have a full sense of what might be the moderators or the mediators being the key parts of the meditation that are creating the outcome I'm seeing, the moderators being the things that are influencing the intensity and so forth of that outcome. If I don't even know what they are, I can't really assess what might be influencing this. So if as a scientist, all I know is the procedural instructions, and I have no sense that there's all these contexts that Tibetans are bringing to that meditation, philosophical understandings, spatial understandings, temporal understandings, I don't even know that they could potentially be important. And so I think it's really an important enabling resource for more nuanced, sophisticated scientific research. I also think it's potentially something really helpful for meditators, both Buddhist meditators in this tradition, as well as other meditators, because it empowers them, I think, to see the broader range of possibilities. So rather than getting frustrated, this is not working for me, they can see, oh, there's actually 20 versions of this meditation. And I can try out other forms that might be much more suitable for my body and my mind and my situation and so forth, as well as just, although I spent my life studying in the Tibetan Buddhist context and had a lot of teachers, often you get frustrated because you learn a meditation, but then you don't necessarily have access to someone to ask like endless amounts of questions about that meditation. And yet here we have in the Tibetan literature, thousands and tens of thousands of pages of great teachers talking about their experience and tips, how you deal with obstacles, how you can enhance your practice or try this variation and so forth. So it really, in my mind, opens up to them the world of wisdom and experience in Tibetan Buddhist work that was always open for Tibetans who were deep readers within the tradition, but is relatively closed off for us. And then finally, well, actually two more. So benefit populace, the broader populace. I'm not interested in meditation, let's say, but I'm interested in general. I'm not actually doing the practice. So I'm that kind of person, the general populace. To my mind, the encyclopedia opens up that world to them. They don't have to buy in. They don't have to buy into a religious tradition or say, I'm a meditator, I believe in meditation, but it opens up to them just what's really happening in this deeply human set of traditions. And they can hopefully then begin to draw parallels in their own life. And hopefully it opens up their appreciation and potential openness to experimenting with such things in their own life in some other form. And then finally, Tibetans themselves, that's a really important consideration for me because I have spent my lifetime benefiting from Tibetans, not just that I have a job at the University of Virginia teaching Tibetan Buddhism, but as an adult, almost all of my teachers were Tibetan, and it's had a massive influence, not just my Buddhist teachers, but also my friends and others in Tibetan culture across the spectrum have had a massive influence on me. And I spent my adult life, since I came to the University of Virginia, really a lot of it working on ways to bring benefit back to Tibetans, given my own station. So I've been very involved with social innovation, education, entrepreneurship training, all sorts of things outside of Tibetan Buddhism. And so as we go forward with this initiative, I'm very sensitive to the potential to just be extractive, to basically say, hey, you guys have done a great job holding these wisdoms, for 14 centuries. We're so sorry about the problems you're having, but we need them right now. So we're going to take them and pull them, bring them over into our context, and you guys just kind of get out of the way because it's time for us to take over. I think sometimes, even with the best of intentions, we're not thinking that way, but our actions are kind of suggestive of that logic. And so it's really important to me that the way we go forward with this initiative, that we're taking into account the perspective of Tibetans as well as the potential benefit to Tibetans. And so right from the start, we've been involving Tibetan lineage holders in this, and we expect to kind of increasingly expand their involvement and begin to pursue how we might do programs that are back in the Himalayas in Bhutan, Nepal, Tibet, and so forth, that can be beneficial for Tibetans who are trying to take these traditions forward in their own futures, like not just a Western future, but a Tibetan future. And just like it always has been, it will change. Tibetan Buddhist contemplative practices have changed every year, every decade since they first started in the 8th century or before on the Tibetan plateau, and they are continuing to change now. And so the more support and help and resources that we can bring to Tibetans who are engaged in those processes is going to be a really important part of the initiative.
Excellent. Thank you for that. Mariana, did you have a question?
I do, but yeah, I mean, I guess can go ahead. When we began the conversation, you talked about all this kind of like implicit elements of contemplative practice that kind of inform, the technique, the methods, that experience. And so I'm just kind of wondering kind of the implications of, as Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism continues to grow and establish and adapt and change in the West, like, the implications of this kind of studying the tradition in this way, like how do we account for those experiential principles in this new context? So I think that would be like an interesting way of looking at the tradition as it adapts and grows.
Yeah, no, that's a great observation and question. And I guess my starting point would be the kind of word that came to mind is love. I mean, I love Tibetan Buddhism. I love the 11th century. I love the elemental theories and so forth. I love Longchenpa's meditations and this poetic contemplative philosophy of the treasury of the expanse, the Trillium and so forth. I love contemporary Tibet. And so I have a deep and abiding love for that context, and that is reflected by my lifelong commitment to those people in that land and so forth. And yet, if we want these things to have a life here in North America in one form or another, we also have to love the land in which we live. We have to love the people that we engage with. We have to have that same expression of love, whether it's elementary school kids in a rural town or whether it's workers suffering from anxiety and stress in a big urban environment. We have to have that love. We have to have that care. We have to care to understand the details of their experiences, of their realities, of their worlds, and not try to shoehorn them into someone else's experiences, whether it's our experiences or Tibetan experiences. So my sense of how we proceed, and there's already, of course, lots of people doing stuff for decades now in the United States and Europe and Canada and so forth. But as we proceed forward, it seems to me that we have to bring together two fundamental streams. One stream is if we choose to take our inspiration from Tibetan Buddhism as opposed to some other contemplative tradition, then we have to have a deep appreciation, respect, and understanding of Tibetan Buddhism. Not just like, oh, this is the formal procedural instructions my teacher taught me, but deeper than that. We have to understand the generative principles that resulted in that, because it's that wellspring of generativity, those headwaters that we need to tap into if we're going to do something fundamentally creative and adaptive and contextually relevant for our time. So that's the first part. I think of that as our inspiration, but it's an inspiration informed by care and understanding. And then on the other part, we have to have the same level of understanding for this place and this time and this culture. To say like, oh, I'm an expert in contemplation. I'm going to go into an elementary school. I'm going to go into a healthcare clinic. I'm going to go into an HR firm. I'm going to go into deal with teenagers suffering from anxiety, and I'm going to help them. That sounds like a recipe for disaster. People, there are experts in these fields. They're the ones who understand those contexts, who have spent a lifetime of working with those people and caring for them and loving them and understanding the details of their experience and their realities and their constraints and their opportunities and their aspirations and their hopes and their fears. Those are the people who have to be the lead. Now, what people can do who are contemplative teachers and scholars and so forth is we can support those people in designing solutions that make sense. And so that's the whole nature of design thinking. It's to say, the designers are here to facilitate, but the first step of design thinking is empathizing, is discovering, is understanding your realities. Like it's an act of surrender. It's not to say like, here's what we're going to do. It's like, we need to understand you before we do anything else. We need to go wide and understand you before we go narrow and begin to define some terms that we can talk about with each other. And so in that process, meditation teachers are really critical, but just as critical and really even more critical are the stakeholders, the people who have expertise and deep knowledge of that situation that we're trying to address. And so designers, meditation teachers, and the stakeholders in that area, it's a relationship of equals. And the design process is to bring that relationship of equals into a fruitful convergence that can produce something that's perfectly suited for these people and this time. And it's going to involve a fundamental rearrangement of things that traditional advocates of a tradition are going to look at and say, oh, but that's not what we do. Well, that's because these aren't you. These are different people in a different space. And it's not just true for Westerners, it's also true for contemporary Tibetans and Bhutanese, that, you know, we have young people coming up whose experience is fundamentally different from their elders. And if all we do in Tibetan and Bhutan, I'm not Bhutanese or Tibetan, but in Tibetan Bhutanese culture, if all we do is we try to say, you must do it the way we always did it, I don't think that's going to work. And it never worked. It was always been adaptive. And it's just the nature of change right now. It's so rapid in pace. It's so complex in form. It's so pervasive in scope. Change has never been so fundamentally changed in character. And that requires us to speed up the pace of innovation. I mean, to look at a separate issue, namely why I think higher education is in a moral crisis. If you look at the implosion of well-being amongst young people in our country, severe depression, severe anxiety, suicide rates, et cetera, it's drastically escalating in the wrong direction. If you look at the rate of innovation in higher education today, it's like that. That is a moral crisis. And you can apply the same logic to Tibetan Buddhism for Tibetans. If people are changing like this and you're changing like that, that gap, it's a moral crisis. So it's not just for us here in our country, it's also for Tibetans themselves. And so trying to make those connections and help young Tibetan and Bhutanese also acquire the skills and the mindsets to think about how they can help their own communities better, as well as kind of function as these cultural bridges, that's really essential in my mind.
Career journeyers. Are you looking to explore what is next in your professional adventure? Minding the Gap Coaching, a leadership and career coaching practice, is here to guide you to new perspectives and approaches about your professional journey. They will take you from where you are to where you want to be.
Excellent. You mentioned at the top of the call, you mentioned the mindfulness movement. And I think it's fair to say that the mindfulness movement, at least when it was really starting to gain steam about a decade or so ago, a decade and a half ago, went out of its way to not directly address its religious or spiritual aspects. They were seen maybe, I think it's fair to say in a lot of cases, they were seen as maybe an obstacle to bringing this practice to the masses. Hard to bring what appears to be a religious text to the PTA meeting and suggest people take up this practice. So I'm just wondering, is the religious or spiritual aspect of Tibetan Buddhism an obstacle here in presenting this? And if it isn't, why not?
Well, to my mind, I think of this in two ways. The first way is we have to understand it. It's a separate question about whether you want to pick that up or use it in some other context and so forth, or you want to try to bypass it and so forth, but you have to understand it. So before you can start making those decisions, if you're going to be inspired by Tibetan Buddhism, you should understand its religious content and how it functions traditionally. And then a separate issue is, what are you going to do with that understanding? And that, to my mind, there's no one answer. It all depends on who you are. I'm very interested in contemporary Tibetan Buddhist communities in the US and the kinds of innovations that they're trying to follow. For example, there's the kind of do-it-yourself refuge tree, where partially in response to the explosion of sexual abuse and so forth, people are thinking about, like, well, what if we make our own refuge trees? What if that becomes a deeply participatory character? It's still highly religious in character, but it's also very innovative in form if you contrast it to traditional refuge trees and so forth. Although one could say traditional refuge trees were also do-it-yourself. They were just do-it-yourself a number of centuries ago. So I'm very interested in that religious context. So in that context, obviously, we're not bypassing religion. But in other contexts, if we're really thinking about things in a context of a public school system or a modern company in the United States and so forth, then obviously religious content is going to be challenging. It's going to be polarizing. It's going to be potentially illegal, et cetera, et cetera. So we do need to think about this religious content and what to do with it. It might be that some parts of it you decide, that's not critical for me, and we can dispense with that. I understand how it worked historically, but I think we can let go of it. It's an incidental component for me, as opposed to a moderator or a mediator. On the other hand, it might be that you say it's absolutely critical, so I need to really think, how can I replace it? Not just get rid of it, not just water it down and dumb it down, but how can I transform it into something different? How can we take a practice that, without a doubt, is inherently religious and will be experienced as such by anybody in the United States, but when I want to go into this secular environment, is there a way that I can find an analog that will not be experienced as religious, but will be able to take the same or some part of the function and meaning and so forth of the original religious elements or principle of organization or context or whatever it might be, and bring that into the modern context? So I think it just all depends on what the context is. Religion is thriving in the world today, so we don't need to get rid of it. But if we're going to go into a public United States context, then from my perspective, Christianity, Buddhism, all these things need to kind of separation of religion and state, don't have a place there. Of course, obviously, we do have a ton of Christian religiosity in the public space, but that's a separate issue. Then we just need to ask the question, how essential is it? Or if it is essential, can we find an analog that partially fulfills it? Or maybe there's a combination of elements that could replace that. I'll give you one little thought or experience I had. When I was doing the Contemplative Science Center at University of Virginia, we partnered with the city of Louisville, and the Brown family there is a prominent family of donors and philanthropists and business people, to create this Compassionate Schools project. We created a curriculum with Alexis Harris and Tish Jennings and others for K through 5 for public school systems, called the Compassionate Schools Project. And as I would visit those schools and think about it, I thought, it's one thing to take these techniques or tools and bring them into the classroom environment there in the public school system. And I think, to my mind, these should be unproblematically, they're not religious in character as such. So to help these kids turn their attention to their bodies and begin to be a little bit more literate in their bodily sensations and connect those to emotional outcomes that are associated with them, or give them tools for down regulating when they're highly agitated because of their situation at home, or tools to focus better or to listen to another kid better. All these things strike me as likely very beneficial in that environment. However, it does not fundamentally solve some of the core problems that we face as a society or to these kids safe. On the one hand, obviously, there's lots of structural constraints, problems with discrimination, socioeconomic disparity, et cetera, that are not going to magically go away because they have these tools. But another issue is, religions historically, whether Judaism or Tibetan Buddhism or evangelical Christianity or whatever it might be, have been broader vehicles that provided narratives and cosmologies and ethical systems and meaningful ways to live that brought together entire communities, that gave individuals a sense of belonging and place and a meaning-rich universe in which to inhabit. We're not doing that when we just take a bunch of tools for mindfulness or yoga or whatever and plop them into a system. It doesn't mean they're not potentially helpful and beneficial, but we would be fools to think we solve the problem by doing that. And we don't live in a Tibetan Buddhist society. We don't live in an evangelical Christian society, despite some people's aspirations. We live in a diverse, heterogeneous society where people come from different backgrounds, different cultural backgrounds, different orientations to spiritual pursuits. Some are religious, some are spiritual and not religious, some are just completely secular, etc. And so we can't unify in that way. And I think that's one of our great challenges of our time, namely how to create something that's as compelling and meaning-rich as religion was historically, and yet has more space for embracing a diversity of cosmologies, value systems, and so forth. So that is one of the most important ways. We can't just discard religion. We have to think about it. We have to kind of work with it as hard as it is. So I'll just give you one little thought. I've been thinking a lot about the preliminary practices in Tibetan Buddhism, the so-called ordinary preliminary practices, which basically rehearse in a contemplative context, they rehearse the kind of main points of Buddhist thought. So you have the nature of human life, impermanence, suffering, and karma. Karma being human agency, or the agency our actions and the consequences our actions have. So traditionally, we'll pick up a Tibetan Buddhist text and it will give us all these reflections and analyses to think about, to meditate upon these things and make them our own. And I've been thinking lately, like, what would those look like if we wrote those for American teenagers? We adhere completely to the form, and yet we write for their time and their space. So what does it mean to be human? If we don't talk about artificial intelligence, that's a joke of a reflection. So if we talk about change, and we don't talk about the change that's happening right now in unprecedented ways all across every sector of our society, that's a joke of a meditation. So if we're going to write those four, in Tibetan Buddhism, they're called the four thoughts that reverse your mind from samsara. If we're going to write the four preliminary meditations for American teenagers with broad scale applicability, it should be written for our place and our time and our sets of considerations. And so I've been just doing that a little bit off to the side, and that's been very helpful for me with thinking about, like, just, you don't just take and adapt, but you take and you're inspired and you think, like, if I really love and care for these people in these time in this space, what will that look like?
Wow. We don't have the time to get into that, but rest assured, we are interested in seeing that from you. That sounds fascinating and truly helpful. I guess two questions that are basically the same question. What is the next big push for the initiative? And again, thank you so much for joining us to talk about it. And how can people who are interested in it follow it and be of support?
Well, thanks so much for giving me the time to talk with you. It's always something that I love to talk about, so I appreciate it. We're finishing up right now the last month of a kind of 12-month startup phase that was funded by the Himera Foundation, very generously funded by them and enabled by them. And so we're currently waiting for the outcome of another funding proposal to the Himera Foundation for a 3-year continuation, hopefully starting this fall. And we're also cultivating other donors. And so we're hopefully in September going to start up in the next phase of this practice, or the next phase of this initiative, which will be a 3-year plan to kind of systematically build out the encyclopedia, to formalize the contemplative design process, and then to work in 3 or 4 different contexts of application. So that's what it looks like. So far, we've been engaging Tibetan lineage holders, Western meditation teachers, designers, and scholars. Those have been our kind of 4 constituencies. We're looking to expand that to include scientists, who I deliberately excluded from year one, thinking we just needed to kind of get our stuff together on our own right. So to expand it to include scientists. And then also, we love to have this micro-phenomenological element, which we started off this year, but in very mild form with Claire Petit-Mengin and some others talking. So that's what it looks like going forward. The scale of it, the pace of it is all going to depend on the funding that we can galvanize, because there's just limits to what such a big, ambitious project can do without funding and kind of paid staff lines, although a lot of the work is volunteer. And so in terms of being involved, we've had 2 workshops so far, one at the Serenity Ridge outside of Charlottesville, Virginia, and one in California at a retreat center there that was enabled by one of our partners. And we've talked to other people who weren't able to come to those retreat centers. But I would say, if you're a meditation teacher or a designer or a scholar or a scientist or a lineage holder, please contact me. Right now, our website is not yet live. That's one of the things we'll get going in the first 4 months or so of the next 3-year project. But my address is very easy. It's my last name, Germano, @virginia.edu. And I would love to hear from you, ideas you have or thoughts or interest in being involved. Really, the idea of this is not a small kind of cadre of people, but a fairly open-ended building of community across these different constituencies. So we're really looking to engage people as widely as possible. And I would love to hear from people about their interest or their own projects that we might kind of partner with or connect to and so forth.
Love it. Thank you. You heard him, folks. Send him your ideas. David Germano, thank you so much for your time and your knowledge. We're very, very lucky and happy to know you. So thanks very much.
Yeah, thanks, both of you. Really enjoyed it quite a lot, this conversation and the previous one.
Excellent.
Thanks for listening. Mission-driven, nonprofit, and community-supported, Lions Roar offers Buddhist teachings, news, and perspectives so that the understanding and practice of mindfulness, compassion, and wisdom flourish in today's world. Go to lionsroar.com and subscribe to receive unlimited access to online articles, meditation instructions, our new Buddhist glossary, and so much more.